already made incredible videos about the problems with spirituality, especially from a more personal perspective. So today I wanted to talk a bit more about some of the political and social issues with this form of spirituality. I'm mainly talking about New Age spirituality, but really this can be applicable to any form of spirituality, especially as it's practiced today more in the mainstream. And my intention is not to say that these practices are inherently bad or that no one should be spiritual. I actually have a spiritual practice myself, and I would consider myself to be spiritual. So my main aim with this video is to try and reignite some more of that political, revolutionary, subversive form of spirituality, rather than the type of passive, apolitical spirituality that we see today. My first problem with these spiritual influences is that they really reinforce so many toxic values. Most spiritual influences are aggressively individualistic and they focus on very self-centered goals. So you will see them do a day in the life vlog, but during their day they're focused on yoga and meditation and showing you the contents of their vegan food, and none of it will revolve around helping out in their communities or doing anything that isn't hyper-focused on themselves. They will talk about things like self-improvement and self-actualization, but it's usually focused on how can they improve their yoga or their bodies or their bank accounts, rather than helping them to improve themselves as people. You will see them talk about manifestation, but it's usually about manifesting a house or money or a car, rather than manifesting trying to bring about a world where we don't have this irreversible climate change looming, or trying to manifest a world where in their communities there isn't as much homelessness. Sometimes they'll talk about non-separation and interconnectedness, but they don't seem in any way to be involved in social movements or have social bonds or have any kind of community solidarity beyond a few yoga retreats. A lot of the time it really feels like they're trying to conform to this male fantasy of the ideal woman by presenting themselves as people that are constantly cooking nourishing food, and they have the ideal perfect body that they're posting online a lot of the time, and they're bubbly and excited and doing things like gardening. And I really think that when I was watching these spiritual videos, I used to always think that in order to be spiritual I had to have the perfect body. In order to be spiritual I had to look like them, I had to do the things that they do. A lot of the time they also reinforce this rags to riches kind of image, like I started off with nothing and then I visualized and I manifested and now I have so much money, now I'm living the best life ever. It really feels like they're trying to promote meritocracy, this idea that the harder you work, the more spiritual you are, the more you visualize, the more stuff you buy that is spiritual, the more that you will succeed. They're basically selling us very aspirational lives. We want their bodies, we want their money, we want their freedom, and in order to get those aspirational lives we're encouraged to consume and buy the latest spiritual product or buy the same things that they are advertising. And spirituality has now become this multi-billion-dollar industry, and so it becomes more about the aesthetics than the spirituality itself. And I think this is very intentional because capitalism is very good at putting a price tag on things in order to neutralize them. So these spiritual influences are sort of selling counterculture, selling the fact that they're subversive and unique and they have their own identities, but really they're just reinforcing the exact same capitalist, consumerist, individualistic values that spirituality is supposed to be subversive of. Rather than just following the trend and reinforcing the same values we've been given our whole lives, I think that spirituality is about engaging our liberatory imaginations and having a vision for the world beyond what currently exists. Spiritual influencers often actually talk about some of the problems in the world. They're often saying that we're losing ourselves and we live in strange times, But instead of drawing attention to some of the social or political or systemic issues that are happening, instead they'll encourage people to take personal responsibility for all of the global problems. So, for example, they're often talking about healing yourself through yoga or meditation or holism. So instead of talking about the ways in which healthcare is privatized and how there's slashing of social services and how so many illnesses and diseases are actually caused by social conditions like stress, instead they will put all the emphasis on us as individuals to heal ourselves. A lot of the time they will talk about the power of now and being present and letting go of distractions, but there's no discussion of how our attention is monetized and manipulated by corporations like Google, Twitter, with algorithms that are constantly sucking us in. Instead of drawing attention to valid problems of unemployment and how our bosses suck and how we're overworked and underpaid, instead it's about meditation and finding joy in life and becoming a better cog in the machine, becoming a better rat in the rat race, and being a more numbed out person. Obviously, everyone has to do what they gotta do in order to survive, and I know that these practices can be incredibly helpful in helping people to deal with their personal issues. I've personally found meditation incredibly helpful for my mental health. But I don't think that it's any coincidence that there's been such a rise and boom in spirituality that coincides with the 2008 financial crash and the rise of neoliberalism and austerity, where social issues have become privatized and individualized, and we're all encouraged to take personal responsibility for every single issue in our lives. When things aren't going very well societally, things like spirituality have always been used as ways to keep us pacified from challenging the social conditions that are harming us. And I think it's so frustrating that these spiritual influences could have such an incredible impact on trying to get us to think critically about politics, about history, about what's currently going on, and instead they're selling us this very pacified way to deal with our problems. And again, I think this is aggressively individualistic, where we see ourselves as these autonomous beings that don't need anyone else, when really I think liberatory spirituality is all about seeing ourselves as part of this interconnected, interdependent web of life. This constant self-surveillance, self-mastery, personal goals, constantly working on yourself, checking in on spiritual progress, reinforces narcissistic self-absorption, where you think that everything revolves around you and you're the most important person in the world. I definitely think I'm guilty of this myself. I sometimes have to check myself when I'm journaling, doing affirmations and visualizations, that I'm not so hyper-focused just on myself. But I think in some cases it can really become this messiah complex, where some people believe that they're so enlightened, that they're so much better than anyone else because they have reached this divinity, this different mode of being. I've heard that some people will try and heal people with their penises because they think that they have some sort of energetic essence that is healing. I think white people, especially white men, are often positioning themselves as experts on spiritual traditions that aren't even their own, on cultures that aren't even their own. I think this can be a way for them to distance themselves from any accountability or responsibility for their actions, because any kind of criticism can just be framed as, this person isn't honoring my truth. I think it's so counter to the values of spirituality that are all about decentering ourselves and letting go of ego. And I think spirituality should also be about non-hierarchy, where we see the value of all beings equally and we let go of this sense of some people are superior to others, because ultimately that leads to all of these forms of oppression where we have white over black, male over female, humanity over nature. So if you're presenting yourself as superior or higher up on the hierarchy, you're ultimately just reinforcing the same problems that we're trying to get away from. And I also think this inherently disempowers people. So people think, I'm not this amazing enlightened being, so I'm just mediocre and I'm not going to be able to do anything meaningful with my existence. And also, I just think this whole self-absorption is inherently just going to make you miserable. I really think that the most joy comes from being of service to others. Obviously, we need time to focus on ourselves, but really, the more self-absorbed you become, the more miserable you become. So many spiritual influencers move to Hawaii and Bali, and it just reinforces this very modern form of colonialism. During colonialism, tropical lands were painted as unspoiled, virginal, Edenic land, and this really justified their conquest and exploitation and expelling local people from their land, destroying local cultures and people. And in the same way today, people talk about Hawaii and Bali as this paradise getaway, this perfect, Edenic, pristine land to justify going to these places, displacing local people from their land through mass gentrification, the inflation of fresh food so local people can't afford it, local culture being destroyed as their languages are dying out, and sacred land is being exploited to make way for holiday resorts and homes for rich white people. Often these spiritual influences will enter these countries with complete cultural insensitivity, not really knowing anything about the culture, the traditions, or the customs in these nations. And a lot of the time, they present this overly romanticized, idealized, essentialized view of these nations, but also of spiritual traditions in general, like Buddhism and Sufism and Taoism. And I've definitely been guilty of this kind of romanticization myself, but I think it's really problematic in the way in which it reinforces this form of Orientalism. Orientalism was used as a tool during colonialism, where Westerners would cherry pick and lump together alternative, often totally unrelated, different customs, traditions, practices to serve their own needs, extracting parts of their culture for their own purposes. So all of this, I would argue, is a very insidious form of colonization over local people, their culture, and their land. There's such a homogeneity in the things that spiritual influencers will talk about. It's usually veganism, yoga, and self-love, and it's strange because they're often talking about getting away from religious doctrine, but the fact that all of them are saying the same things just seems to become a new form of dogma. It's very prescriptive, very much always propagating the same things. And it really frustrates me because there are so many fascinating elements of spirituality to be explored, so many different movements, so many different people all across the globe practicing it in different ways. For example, I think Haitian voodoo is so incredibly fascinating because it was used as solidarity against slavery and colonization and really helped to foster the revolution that birthed Haiti. And they also have this belief system that one can learn everywhere and at all times. You can learn from plants, you can learn from animals, you can learn from spirits, you can learn everywhere basically. And I think this really challenges the Western Eurocentric model of knowledge where everything is about intellectual, cerebral forms of knowing. I think it's also really fascinating that so many spiritual traditions have this view where they don't believe there is a separation between nature and humanity, whereas here in the West we always believe that we are above nature, we can dominate nature, we can exploit nature. So to think about this form of spirituality, I think, is so incredibly fascinating because it could really help us to transform the ways in which we approach nature, it could perhaps lead to some sort of revolution in our practices if we were to really take this worldview seriously. There are so many fascinating elements of spirituality that we could learn from, and so it frustrates me so much that there is such a prescriptive homogeneity to spirituality, because it makes people believe that the kind of mainstream image of spirituality is the only form of spirituality that exists. Very much related to my problem with spiritual influences being very homogenous and prescriptive is also the fact that they're constantly using the same vapid words, vapid sentiments. For example, they will talk about inner truth, the fact that all of your knowledge resides within you, which I think it's great to trust your intuition, but at the same time, we should be learning from other people. We should be learning from other people's perspectives. We should be challenging what we're taught. We should be questioning where the information comes from that we think that we know. But instead, this kind of focus on inner truth shuts down really being curious about any other perspective other than our own. Spiritual influencers will often talk about blessing our food and the sacredness of food, even though they seem to see such value and sanctity in food. They never seem to discuss any problems of food distribution where millions are starving whilst so much food goes to waste, and they don't talk about the ways in which corporations like Monsanto are attempting to control the global food supply through their patenting of seeds, and they don't talk about the ways in which the avocado they are eating has been made by people exploited all across the globe. They talk about the inherent value of all beings, but most of the time they seem to be passive observers of human suffering from poverty, inequality, police brutality, militarized violence. They talk about healing through crystals that are supposed to get rid of negative energy, but crystals are extracted from the earth in environmentally destructive ways, often through slave labor. Just about everything that we owned is surrounded by negative energy. We're constantly touching blood-drenched commodities. The idea that crystals are going to heal ourselves from that just seems like another way to completely distance ourselves from what's going on in the world. Often spiritual influencers will talk about how much they love nature, and they will go around hugging trees and sometimes promote sustainable fashion. But I'm not convinced that we will have oxygen to breathe in the not too distant future, and the wars of the 21st century are supposed to be all about access to water. So it feels quite vapid to talk about how much you care about the natural world, but at the same time be doing nothing to use your platform to prevent the destruction of the environment. Sometimes they will do rituals under the stars for world peace and harmony, which is all well and good, but complex issues like mass incarceration, police brutality, ableism are not going to be solved by doing a moon dance or baying at the moon, and doing downward facing dog on a mountaintop is not a radical political position. The thing that frustrates me the most about it is that there is often a lot of truth to what they're saying. I do think it's helpful to see the sanctity of food and the value of all beings and the interconnectedness between us and all the other things in the world, and I do think hugging trees and doing rituals under the moon sound like a lot of fun. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to be a social justice warrior and have caveats with every single statement that they say that relate it back to politics, but at the same time, if they're only ever making these kind of vapid statements without relating it to anything political, without in any way talking about the social issues around these things, then I think it ultimately does more harm than good, because it gives people the impression that simply talking about these things is enough, when in reality what we need is some sort of revolution in our values and some sort of mass mobilization to actually be able to solve many of these problems. Another problem with spiritual influencers is that they have this idea that you attract what you focus on. So they tell you to be relentlessly, constantly positive, because if you're not positive, then you are attracting negativity into your life. And I think most of us understand the problems with this. It's not good to suppress our emotions. Our emotions should be ebbing and flowing, and our emotions can also be instructive. They can teach us about what's wrong in our lives or what's wrong in the world. But I think some of the more political issues with this type of toxic positivity and law of attraction is less discussed. One thing that really frustrates me about it is that if you can't hold space and have empathy for your own suffering, it's really difficult for you to hold space and have empathy for other people that are suffering all across the globe. I also think it's really toxic to tell people who are marginalized and oppressed to simply be positive and meditate away their rage and overcome their social problems through spirituality alone, because it's just another form of silencing and tone policing marginalized people. And most of the time, oppressed people have never achieved anything without some kind of mobilization that requires righteous anger and requires some emotions that aren't just constantly toxically positive. This type of thing is just a form of spiritual bypassing the idea that complex issues in the world can be solved purely through spirituality. It also means that privileged spiritual people never have to confront their privileges, because they can just convince themselves that they achieved all that they did because of manifestation or visualization. It can also lead to this form of victim blaming, where we blame people for their suffering. So instead of confronting social issues like ableism, homophobia, racism, we instead blame individuals for their suffering. And I think that's so toxic. I remember that when I was younger, I used to think that I had done something wrong to attract sexually violent men into my life. I used to ask myself, why has the universe sent this to me? And I think that's such a toxic way to think. It's so damaging. It can also lead to this echo chamber where you only ever surround yourself by high vibrational, positive people because you don't want to be brought down by energy vampires. And I think this leads to people getting rid of anyone out of their lives that is suffering or struggling. It also means you can completely disengage from politics or social issues, because most of the time it's not the happiest thing in the world to think about. All of that being said, I do strongly believe in the power of thought, and I do think there can be a lot of value in some forms of law of attraction or manifestation or visualization if it's used correctly or not in such a toxic way. However, this form of spiritual bypassing and toxic positivity really needs to end, and I think it's also just an inaccurate portrayal of what spirituality is supposed to be. Spiritual transformation is not supposed to be a positive, light, easy experience. It often involves a complete overhaul of every aspect of our beings and looking at the darkest sides of ourselves. It means confronting our privileges and the ways in which we have perpetuated harm ourselves. And for me, seeing that life can be brutal but also can be beautiful is much healthier and enables me to live a much more contented existence than if I were constantly trying to be toxically positive. It's very common for spiritual influencers to make out that simply by adopting spirituality, the world will be transformed, people will naturally be more empathetic and compassionate. And I've definitely had this mindset until very recently, actually, until I learnt some of the more darker sides of spirituality. But the truth is that there's such a long history of spirituality being used to perform atrocities, fascism, genocide. We saw this in Nazi Germany, and we saw this with about 10 million Japanese Buddhists using spirituality to support war and imperialism. So I think this idea that spirituality will inherently lead to positive outcomes is really problematic, because it can just lead to us being very passive and apolitical because we think, oh, we're spiritual, we have done our bit in the world, when actually spirituality has to be matched with progressive politics. Otherwise it risks leaving this vacuum to be filled by the right wing, because ultimately spirituality is not an end in and of itself, it's just a tool. It's a tool that can be used to create a transformed world, or it's a tool that can lead to fascism. Sometimes spiritual influencers will promote conspiracy theories like anti-vax, or make predictions for the future like the idea that climate change will soon end. And they often say things like mistrust everything, don't trust authority, and they really attract people who are critical of the establishment. But instead of really speaking to their very valid concerns about the state of the world, they will instead lead them down a conspiracy pathway. And it frustrates me because there are so many things in this world that should be conspiracy theories but aren't, like poverty and inequality and the way the climate is being destroyed. And these spiritual influences could really speak to those problems rather than perpetuating utter nonsense. It also means that often they take no responsibility or accountability for their actions, because any kind of criticism at all is just an attack on them by the brainwashed masses. And sometimes they even have the audacity to present themselves as marginalized people, even though they themselves might occupy the most privileged positions within society. It should be pretty obvious by now that one of the things that frustrates me the most is how apolitical these spiritual influences are, and it just doesn't make any sense, because if you really believe in creating a spiritual revolution, spiritual liberation for all, you have to be politically engaged. There's no such thing as being apolitical. If you're apolitical, you're just accepting the values of the society that you've been given. You're just accepting the status quo. And at this moment in time, there's such a political warfare against spiritual values. So if you really care about spiritualities, you will want to be politically engaged. The reason there's this political warfare against spirituality is because people who are spiritually healthy don't want to consume to fill the empty void within them. If people saw all beings as sacred, we wouldn't justify exploiting them, killing them, wars or conflict. If we believed we had a deep connection with nature, we wouldn't allow it to be plundered and destroyed. Political powers need us to be spiritually sick, they need us to be spiritually dead inside. So if you're not actively political in some way, then you're just working as a weapon for the reproduction of this spiritual destruction. Throughout history, there are so many examples of spirituality being fiercely politically engaged. Many of the greatest anti-colonial movements were led by Sufi masters. Liberation theology and their Judaic tradition talks about feeding the hungry, welcoming immigrants, protecting the poor. Magic and witchcraft have mobilized resistance against environmental destruction. Spirituality has been used in social movements against kings, slaveholders, Nazis, and invading armies. So this kind of apolitical spirituality feels very disrespectful to this lineage and to the radical, revolutionary, subversive potential within spirituality. I want to reiterate again that there's not anything inherently wrong with a lot of the things that I've criticized today, like the vapid words, or like manifestation and visualization or meditation or any of these things. It's more about the ways in which they are practiced. I'm mostly trying to make the point that spirituality must be deeply connected with the political in order for it to be truly liberatory. I think a truly liberatory form of spirituality could help us transform our relationship with each other and the natural world so that we stop exploiting and destroying them. I think that it could be so powerful if we learned from these resistance movements that were spiritual and what practices they used. I think there's so much within the worldview of spirituality that we can learn from that completely challenges the Western way of doing things. I think that there's also so much value in spirituality helping us to fill this empty void within us so that we're no longer so disconnected and apathetic and disengaged from the world around us. I think if we have a political transformation but don't also have a spiritual transformation, then we're just going to fill the world with more egoic, consumeristic, individualistic people, so we're ultimately just going to reproduce the same problems we're trying to get away from. We can hug trees and do moon rituals and believe in the power of thought whilst at the same time being deeply politically engaged. We can use things like visualization, manifestation as ways to envision the type of world that we want to see and work towards creating that world. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to link in the description box many YouTubers, podcasters, books and thinkers in general that talk about spirituality from this more political perspective, because there are many of them doing incredible work. And if you like this video, I think you would also like my video on God versus capitalism, where I talk about the ways in which capitalism has become the new world religion. And I would really appreciate it if you could consider becoming a patron to help me to continue to make videos, as these take a long time to make. But thank you so much for all of my patrons for making these videos possible. I appreciate you so much. Bye!